recognize a miracle if it takes place against a backdrop of order. If we lived in a completely chaotic universe, how could we recognize a miracle? Everything would be a miracle. Everything's crazy and chaotic and doesn't follow any laws. So we recognize God's miracles because He performs them within a universe of order. St. Anselm very helpfully clarified this point. He said that God has His absolute power, or potentia absoluta for you Latinists, and His ordered power, or potentia ordinata. That is to say, sure, God has the raw power to turn that object into Elvis, but He also has His ordered power by which He behaves according to the laws that He's built into the universe, that it would not befit the dignity of our God for Him to behave in such a whimsical way. He can't do that. He has to, in effect, behave in a way that is consistent with His promises to us. And in effect, the functioning of the universe is one of those promises. So we expect to find order in the universe, and that's why scientists go looking for it. But as I say, not all civilizations have been able to do this, have had this insight. We take this insight for granted. The universe makes sense, we can find mathematical relationships in it, but not every civilization could. And one civilization that could not is Islamic civilization. Now, there's much we can say about Islamic contributions to civilization and even the sciences. For example, in some of what we might call the applied sciences, like medicine and optics. Well, Muslims made great contributions in those areas. But in the more theoretical sciences, Islamic science, in effect, suffered what Father Stanley Yaki calls a stillbirth. It seemed like it was going somewhere, and then boom, gone. And then today, of course, Islamic civilization is largely a backwater, scientifically. Now, why is that? Why did Islam suffer such devastation in terms of the sciences? One reason involves this matter of the ability to view the universe as being orderly. Islamic civilization could not do that. Because if you were to say that the universe is ordered according to certain laws that must be observed, that would be an insult to Allah, who may behave as arbitrarily as He wants. What looks like a law to you may just be one of His habits that He can discontinue at any time. Well, we got a break now, but come on back for some more myth-busting about the Church and science. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Before the break, we discussed some forbidden truths about the Church and science. We know what we're supposed to say. We're supposed to say the Church has been nothing but an obstacle to the sciences. But that's not what professional historians of science are saying. And if you recall from our first episode, I mentioned that the most depressing job on earth would be to be a professor of medieval studies, trying to tell people that the Middle Ages weren't really so bad. Well, I think a good runner-up for most depressing job on earth would be to be a historian of science, trying to argue that, in fact, the Church had, by and large, a positive influence on the sciences. Even your fellow scientists aren't going to believe you, much less the general public. But yet you have an enormous amount of evidence that you can amass. And book after book after book is being written today, and yet you still can't crack through to the general public. One of the reasons I ended up writing a book called How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization was that I was afraid that all these wonderful studies that professors are doing that are vindicating the Church aren't getting to the general public. People are still being taught the nonsense about the Church as an opponent of science. So now we've got to go and study this stuff so we can better defend ourselves. But let me tell you something. Today, if you were taking a course on the history of science, and some universities have that as a separate discipline, if you were taking a course in that, and you said, oh, religion and science have been nothing but enemies over the years, you would be considered to have written, in effect, a fourth-grade term paper. Like, no one would take that seriously anymore. So let's return to our discussion from before the break, when I was saying that the key insight that allows a breakthrough in science in the West is the Catholic view of God as being orderly, a view that is derived principally, though by no means exclusively, through that wisdom verse, 11:21, that God has ordered all things according to measure, number, and weight. And we saw that St. Augustine took that to mean that God was a great geometer, and other Christian thinkers elaborated on it as well. At the cathedral school at Chartres, for example, in France, there was a lot of elaboration on that critical wisdom verse. Now, cathedral school, first of all, what's that? Charlemagne, who was emperor of the West from about 768 to 814, had established that the various cathedrals should have schools set up attached to them. And these cathedral schools, in some cases, developed into our earliest universities, although we'll discuss that in a future episode. But at the cathedral school at Chartres, those scholars seized upon Wisdom 11:21 and took it to mean that if we want to understand the universe, we must understand it quantitatively. That's a fancy way of saying that if we want to understand the universe, we have to understand it through math. Well, that is actually an extraordinarily modern idea. The cathedral school at Chartres was really at its peak perhaps in the 12th century, and yet it's got this fantastically modern idea that at least at some level, the universe can and should be understood mathematically if we want to understand its workings and predict how it will behave in the future. We have to understand it through math. And they interpreted Wisdom 11:21 to mean just that the universe is mathematical and we understand it that way. Because the cathedral school at Chartres spread this idea far and wide that the universe is mathematical and should be understood through math, they are increasingly given credit as having helped to launch the scientific revolution centuries before it really began to take place in the 17th century. In addition to that, the scholars at Chartres took for granted that God was orderly and had built natural laws into the world, and that if we want to understand how the world works, we first use our natural reason. And only when our natural reason breaks down do we then say we are faced with a miracle, we're faced with something supernatural, and we refer this to God. But the Chartres scholars were convinced that God has given us our reason for a reason. That we're not cows, we're not aardvarks, we're not ants. We have the ability to think and to draw cause and effect conclusions and relationships. Why would God give us this faculty unless we were meant to use it? And we become true human beings only when we use the unique gift that human beings alone possess, which is reason. So, for example, one scholar at Chartres said, "It is through reason that we are men. For if we turned our backs on the amazing rational beauty of the universe we live in, we should indeed deserve to be driven therefrom, like a guest unappreciative of the house into which he has been received." Another scholar at Chartres said, "I take nothing away from God. He's the author of all things, evil excepted. But the nature with which he endowed his creatures accomplishes a whole scheme of operations, and these too turn to his glory, because it is he who created this very nature." In other words, God created us with a rational nature. So we give him glory when we have recourse to that rational nature. Now that is very much the opposite of what people are told, isn't it, about the Catholic Church? I think most people are